There is no official calling of the Western Cape provincial ballot yet, but there's 70% already that's been counted and declared so far. So it's pretty clear that there will be a continuation of Democratic Alliance government here in the Western Cape. With that 70% counted so far, the Democratic Alliance has 54% of the votes. So Premier Alan Winde will be sworn in for a second term in about two and a bit weeks' time. The second story in the Western Cape, in order of poll performance, is the shrinking of the ANC as opposition here in the Western Cape. The Patriotic Alliance is also another story here. It overtakes the Economic Freedom Fighters in the Western Cape to be the third largest party in the Western Cape province so far. But there's been no seat allocation yet for the provincial legislature. That happens after all provincial results are in. 42 seats in the Western Cape Provincial Parliament. But with some simple, quick maths and a little thumb suck, it's quite clear that the Democratic Alliance will get the majority of that 42 seats, possibly around 22, 23 seats in the provincial legislature. But then let's look at the parties, the smaller parties. In the previous provincial legislature, we had 7 parties represented here in the Western Cape. We may have a little more because parties currently trending over at least 1%. Remember, still 70% of the vote counted, 30 more to go, but parties currently trending over 1% of the vote so far is good. The ACDP, Al Jamaa, and the Freedom Front, they're likely to get 1, if not 2, seats in the provincial legislature. The Cape Coloured Congress also performing relatively well, 2.7% for the Triple C, and then the EFF, now the 5th largest, if we believe this current statistic of 70% of the votes counted, the EFF with 4.49% of the vote here in the Western Cape. So that's the provincial picture. But we wake up in a country with a national political landscape that reflects a sea change in South African parliamentary politics. Again, only 52% of the national voting districts completed. Yes, there are news organizations. Yes, there is the Center for Scientific and Industrial Research who have made projections and have already called this election. We will go with what the IEC says. But with 52% of voting districts completed, the ANC will be on track to lose a parliamentary majority for the first time in its history in a democratic South Africa. The result of the national ballot. Remember, 3 ballots, and there are 2 ballot papers that make up the composition of how we will allocate seats to the National Assembly. The national ballot, the compensatory ballot, has the ANC so far at 42%, the Democratic Alliance at 23%. The MK Party currently leading the EFF. What happens to Julius Malema now? He's seen a significant drop. Will members of the EFF now look at Julius Malema and ask, are you the man to really take us where we need to be? Will the EFF ask questions of itself? But the MK Party currently leading the EFF with about 10.7% of the vote. The EFF currently below 10%. But again, that's not the final result. That's not how seats will be allocated in the 400-seat National Assembly. Also, results of the regional ballots will need to be added to get a clearer picture of how those 400 seats will be divided. But clearly, by itself, the ANC does not have a 50 plus 1% majority to govern outright. So there are a couple of scenarios that could play itself out in South Africa. And throughout the course of your show, I'm going to invite you to give me your take, your thoughts on what you believe to be the best scenario for South Africa. I also will speak to analysts like Professor Ray Parsons and Stephen Friedman. But here's what we're currently looking at in terms of partnerships, in terms of coalitions, or maybe even minority government. Scenario 1 would say that the ANC and the EFF goes into a coalition. That gives them enough to vote for a speaker, vote for a president, and to govern together. That's one scenario. Another scenario is the ANC and the MK party. Duduzile Zuma tweeting yesterday that the ANC and the MK would never go into a coalition, but never say never in politics. Who knows? Third scenario, ANC and the Democratic Alliance. That they decide to co-govern. They split between who governs the executive and who manages the legislature. Maybe some concessions in terms of what's happening in Gauteng, maybe, which is currently also a hung assembly. A fourth scenario would be the ANC and as many of the smaller parties together, coming together to try and get as close to that 50% mark as possible. An improbable, but not impossible scenario is that there's a Democratic Alliance-led opposition bloc. So which means all opposition parties and the Democratic Alliance say, we're actually going to form a voting bloc, a coalition bloc, to officially take the ANC out of government. That would mean the DA working with the MK, the EFF, the Patriotic Alliance, good everyone who may be forming the membership of the National Assembly. That's the fifth scenario. And then the sixth scenario would be an ANC minority government. That's an ANC minority government that struggles to govern. Snap elections being called at a whim. A president that could resign by the end of the year. A National Assembly that is so precarious. But would it work? And I'd like to know what would work for you. ANC EFF, ANC MK, ANC DA, ANC smaller parties, a DA-led coalition bloc of opposition parties to officially take the ANC out of government, or an ANC minority government. 021-446-0567. It's not easy decisions. It's not easy choices. But what do you think would benefit South Africa, or should I say would do the least damage to South Africa, depending where you are?